you so much for being here with us. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your research and work?
Yeah, well, and once again, thank you guys for having me on. My name is Matthew McBirth. I serve at Ozark Christian College / Lincoln Seminary here in Joplin, Missouri, the great southwest of Missouri. And I teach in biblical studies and also biblical justice. So kind of two different areas and degrees at our college and seminary. And particularly, I've been studying the last few years for my doctoral program, the context of the New Testament. That has been my primary just field, is figuring out the culture that the New Testament was written in, the cultures the New Testament was written in, and so that it can help me better understand, of course, the text itself. And so my journey from, I was actually just thinking about this with my wife the other day. Been in school now for the last 12 years, technically, of like the duration of it all, 13 years, I guess, 10 years of undergrad, master's, finishing up my doctoral program. So ready for that to be over with. But in my master's degree, I was trying just to study about the church is supposed to look multi-ethnic, multicultural. And so I was kind of running into issues of different ways that people thought that could happen today, how to take a church from being homogenous to being diverse. And so I started studying that in my master's degree, came across this idea of hospitality in the ancient world, and wondered maybe that is actually the way the New Testament authors framed how they could be this group, this global church, this global community of different ethnicities and people groups and socioeconomic classes. And I think they framed it up in hospitality. And so my last few years have just been studying hospitality in the New Testament world, trying to figure that out, which is allowed me to dive into texts like First Peter and some of Paul's writings in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts.
Cool. And
Yeah.
we didn't just invite you on because you're a personal friend of mine. You've recently come out with,
Yeah.
although we do like to prioritize our friends, but you've also
Yeah.
recently come out with a chapter in a book. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So speaking of First Peter, we just released a book that's called Upon This Rock, and the subtitle is very long, so I don't have to feel like I need to say it all, but Upon This Rock. And the idea was Protestants love Paul. We love Paul's words, and yet I think we have neglected the words of Peter, the life of Peter. And oftentimes, I mean, you guys know this from being in the church. I even pay attention to this more now. If someone makes a reference to Peter from the pulpit, it is normally him messing up in some form or fashion. We have to, insert joke here of Peter kind of fumbling it up. And so whenever we think of Peter, it tends to be as, oh, he messed up, or he's just being obnoxious once again, or Peter's putting his foot in his mouth. Where instead we thought, no, we need to actually learn from this person that is mentioned, I think second to Jesus, is mentioned the most times when it comes to like a human being in the New Testament. I think he is mentioned more times than Paul's name is mentioned. And yet we cater more towards Pauline theology, which is, of course, nothing wrong with that. So this book is about what can we learn about discipleship, what can we learn about following Jesus through the life and teachings of Peter. And so we kind of look at the Gospels, of course, look at his discourses in the book of Acts, and then we get into First Peter as well. And that's where my chapter really comes into this. It's kind of weird. I was talking with Seth about this. We did not plan on releasing this book. Of course, we had no idea that the Pope was going to pass away, and that a new Pope was going to be
Speaking of suffering.
Sure, you didn't.
Yeah, we planned it.
Sure you didn't.
Last year in January.
Suffering and Peter.
Yes.
Too perfect, man.
Too perfect. Yes. But I mean, I literally yesterday was looking at all of the different tweets and stuff about who the new Pope was and seeing his tweets as well. But all that is to say is, I think because of, at least in the circles that I'm in, believers, followers of Jesus have a skepticism towards the papacy. And because of that, I think the whole idea of Peter being the first pope, it was, once again, kind of lowers him on the list. And so we didn't plan to do it, but my chapter in this book, whenever they listed out all the different things to talk about, was like, what's Peter's theology of suffering? Of course, no one wants to take that, and so I said, I will gladly take that. Let's talk about a theology of suffering and try to solve the problem that everyone deals with on a regular basis. So that is what my chapter is. It specifically does look at First Peter, but it's also trying to see the Christian response to suffering, and the different options, the different choices that people could choose from in the ancient world, what other thinkers were saying of how to respond to suffering, what suffering was, and then trying to locate what was a Christian response during that time.
That's super interesting. But before we leave the topic, I've got to ask, what do you think of the new Pope?
I don't know. I don't know much about him. It was very interesting to see that no one thought an American would become, the next pope, and then lo and behold, we have what I'm hearing is the least American that could be pope. So I don't know. I saw some of his tweets yesterday that he said, throughout the last couple months, and I am very neutral on him, and I'm leaning towards he seems like a great guy, but again, I have no idea.
I'm just excited for the first pope, to have the thick Chicago style pizzas, to probably have an open carry license. I'm just expecting the papal see to be flying the Chicago Bears flag soon,
So, what I really wanted was for him to begin, when he comes out and faces everyone for the first time as Pope, I was ready for him to have a thick Chicago accent. And of course he speaks loud.
Dang it.
Of
course.
It's just like, okay, never mind. I did not have good expectations for this. So it was probably wise for him to do the way he did it.
The memes that are going to come out of this are going to be excellent. That's all I'm going to say. That's close to my heart.
If he speaks a second language, is he still even American, really? I mean, isn't that a disqualifying factor?
It is pretty interesting.
How many languages do you know, John?
Hey, we're focusing on America right now, Seth.
That's good. It is interesting how most Americans only know one language, and you go outside of the country, and most people know multiple languages. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And so let's get into the subject then. What is sort of suffering for the biblical writers, and how is Paul's position on how's Peter? Sorry, we're so Pauline in our thought. I can't even ask the question.
Wow, John.
Well, so let me start again. This is bad.
Good.
What is suffering for the biblical writers, and where does Peter's unique vision of suffering fit into that?
Yeah. So whenever I was looking at this and seeing what other people were and seeing how they were defining suffering from a biblical worldview, I appreciate trying to give a broad definition to it so that it can fit multiple experiences into it. And so what I would say is that suffering is experiencing deep hurt, and that could be mentally, that could be physically, that can be economically, but experiencing deep hurt or loss in some part or facet of our lives, that truly is an experience of we have just lost something, whether that being security, protection, dignity, and it's something that can be experienced individually or collectively. And I think that's pretty consistent throughout the Bible, actually. So I think when Peter enters into this, he has that same mindset. But there's kind of two different categories I think we would want to say, and this is what I try to make clear in my chapter. There's suffering that is cause and effect, you did this thing, and of course now you're going to deal with the consequence from that. So I'm cutting my grass, and there's this massive thorn bush in the back of my property that I should probably just get rid of, but I'm going to be lazy and not get rid of it. And then I, run into it, and thorns are the worst things ever. And it pricks me, and I just experienced physical pain right there, right? But that's more of I caused that to actually take place. What I really talk about in my chapter, and what I think Peter is trying to deal with in First Peter, is what seems to be unjustified suffering. You didn't do anything to deserve this. It's kind of random, coming out of nowhere. And the question is, how do we respond to that? And so when Peter enters this, he's talking to Christians. He literally says that they are suffering because of the name of Christ. And it's one of the few references that we actually see the word Christian used in the New Testament. One's in Acts, the other one is in First Peter. And so that seems to be like a unique experience for them. They are suffering, at least in some regard, because they follow Jesus. And I try to go a little bit more in my chapter to see what exactly might they have been experiencing. But I think what Peter is addressing is not you have done something, unwise, and now you are, reaping the consequences. He's responding to what happens when it seems like you're actually doing what you should be doing. You're following Jesus, and yet you're suffering. And that's what Peter responds to.
So there's a difference between suffering, cause and effect, right? You do something stupid, and, you reap the consequences, right?
Yes.
There versus the suffering, like, I haven't done anything wrong. In fact, I've done something, the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And my suffering is unjustified. And
Yeah.
it's that latter degree of suffering that's what Peter's trying to deal with. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. And I think that's what most of the Bible, at least when it deals with suffering head on, is what it's trying to address. Like the Old Testament will address, like, yeah, we've messed up, and so we're going to exile. But like they kind of understand why they're going to exile. They messed up, they worshipped other gods, and the prophets came and told them this is what's going to happen if you don't stop. Now they're going. Now, there's still a place, though, even for that, I will say, within the biblical canon, to say that you can still wonder, though, why is there so much suffering? Why does it seem like the consequences for my actions seem to be way bigger, way deeper than the action itself? And so I think you see places for that, like the Book of Lamentations would be a good place to go to. And I wonder if that's in Peter's mindset as he's writing First Peter. But yeah, I think what we're trying to go more towards is kind of like Job. I just got done with a lunch, and we had a student give his Devo. It's kind of the tradition here is during the last faculty and staff lunch, we have a graduating senior give a Devo for us, and his Devo was, or at least he addressed the book of Job, right? And so Job deals with Job is a righteous man, and yet he loses everything. How do we respond to that? And what's fascinating is that in the ancient world, people had responses to it. And so I think when Peter is writing the Christians throughout Asia Minor in First Peter, and we see it in other places, of course, I think Paul does actually address this too. But he's trying to say, this is how you should frame this up, the suffering that you're experiencing, and this is how you should respond to it.
That's interesting to me because you have certain ideas of karma, and karma tries to work with why is there unjust suffering by saying there is no such thing as unjust suffering. Everything reduces down to the sort of cause and effect that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, karma itself just means action, right?
Okay.
Actions have effects. And the Bible tackles this head on and just says, what do we do if there really is unjust suffering, which there seems to clearly be in the world?
Yeah, yeah. And it's fascinating with that, Seth. Would it be with the karma mindset? Is it always that individual did do something at some point in their life or past life that is the reason why they're experiencing the suffering?
Yeah, it's a broad tradition, right?
Okay.
Because some of these traditions don't even believe in a perduring self, a self that sort of goes through. So
Okay.
like Buddhism doesn't. That's
Yeah.
part of the illusion that you need to escape from.
Okay.
Is that you even exist as an individual self. So, but there are two broad traditions. One says, yes, if you punch someone in the face, broadly speaking, retributively, at some point in the future, you will get punched in the face to teach you a lesson. There's another version that's kind of closer to virtue ethics, which is like if you punch someone in the face, the real victim is you, that corrupts your soul. And that's what needs to be worked out through the processes of life. It's not necessarily that you get punched in the face. You need to learn the damage that does to yourself so that you can heal that part of yourself.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
In a past life, I used to pontificate about other religions. And so in this life, I have to sit here and listen to Seth to suffer what I inflicted upon others. And this is This is the way.
Patience.
Clearly, he hasn't learned. Have you heard him speak recently?
And that's what's kind of fascinating about Peter's context, at least with the Greco-Roman world. And so in my chapter, I just say, okay, so they are dealing with suffering. What would a Gentile Christian, which is what we think would be the predominant, at least, audience that Peter is writing to throughout Asia Minor, as they're experiencing what they might deem unjustified suffering for following Jesus, which is a good thing. They should be following Jesus, and yet they're suffering. What would they go to? What would be their, gut reaction to say, this is the reason why we're suffering? And so throughout, the main one that I look at the Stoic philosopher Seneca, to see kind of how he responds to what suffering is. And his point, which I just found fascinating, is suffering is he almost wants to say it's not really even suffering. It's the sense of this is actually something that's going to make you better. There's nothing bad about it. It doesn't come from a place of evil or malice. It's actually just how the world operates, and it's how you respond to that suffering that ends up making you more virtuous. That ends up being his big thing, of course, is that the gods are putting this before you as a test, and how you respond to this will either make you better or worse, or makes the world better or makes the world worse. And so I wonder if a lot of the Christians, being Gentile in that time, would have wondered, is God the one that's actually causing this? Is he the one that's bringing this on us? And I couldn't help but think about my context and just growing up originally from the Midwest, Louisville, Kentucky area, now in Southwest Joplin. I've just seen it being the same just across these states, and then also in just different places around the country, with how quick we are that when we are experiencing suffering, our first thought is, I must have done something wrong, and God is doing something. God is the one that's causing this suffering. He's the one that's putting this in front of me. And from really big things, such as disease, or not being healed, even though you've been asked for healing for something, to really small things, as I work with my college students and they wonder why their car isn't working. My car is not working because I must have done something wrong, or God is trying to test me in some way. And we just had this quick thought of, this is coming from a place of just neutrality. And I think Peter wants to push back against that it doesn't come from a place of neutrality, that there's actually something bad. There's actually something bad about suffering.
That's interesting because, I think a lot of people who don't even believe in God have that intuitive kind of response, that reaction. Am I being punished in some sort of cosmic sense for their actions? It is interesting. They have that reaction.
People say, what's the universe saying to me, because of this? Is the universe saying something to me? And I don't know what their full-on, worldview is with it, but it is interesting how the gut response is something neutral or good. Either it's God and they even believe that he is a good God, or it's just the universe, and the universe is just neutral, but it's coming from this neutral or positive space, either out of a reaction, like a karma thing, or as a way to test me to become better. And ultimately, Peter says, I think what is very unique to Peter, and I think just to the New Testament, is suffering can come, unjustified suffering comes from evil. That it's not actually how the world should be. And so if you read throughout First Peter, Peter will multiple times address Satan, being around, trying to prowl around like a roaring lion. He'll talk about how Jesus has declared victory against the spirits in 1 Peter 3, I believe it is. And so he seems to put this, what I call an eschatological worldview to them, of saying, we're in the last days, but there's still a battle going on. And yes, Jesus has won the battle. He is victorious, but there is still evil, demonic, and just we would just say malice, vice out there that is trying to cause hurt and pain to you. And that is the source of this unjustified suffering. It's not that you've been doing something wrong, keep following the Lord Jesus. It's realized that this is coming from ultimately Satan, his minions, and just evil.
So they introduce these other malevolent agents into the equation. Peter does. He introduces them to basically say there's a cosmic picture here that you're missing out on. Is that right?
I think he's trying to give them a lens, like a new pair of glasses, to say there's another element that you're not seeing. Let me show it to you. And that it's not just you and God, but there is this evil demonic realm that is still at war with us, which is why I think he ultimately says, it's pretty fascinating. Whenever I look at what the Christians are dealing with in Asia Minor, specifically in 1 Peter 2 and 3, Peter will address slaves and wives. It's a household code, and we see that in Paul's letters. But you guys know, as in Paul's letters, he kind of deals with the pairings. So slaves, masters, wives, husbands, and then sometimes we'll even deal with like elders and youngers, like sons and daughters, children. And Peter weirdly doesn't really do the pairing. At least he doesn't do it well. He just does slaves. He doesn't address masters. He does wives, and he has one small note to husbands, which I think is still pretty in depth. He ultimately says, take care of your wives, or your prayers will not be heard by God. So it's pretty detrimental. So he does deal with them, but just it's very small. And so I just wondered, why is Peter only addressing slaves and wives? What would they have been dealing with in particular that is causing them suffering? And I think they would have been experiencing oppression and suffering now that they are Christians, and yet they still live in a pagan world, still have right down the street the idols and the festivals for the different gods, still have in their very own house the household gods that they should be worshiping every single day. The slaves would be helping prepare meals, making sure the shrine is still upkept. The wives would be doing the same thing. And so they are very much, close to the very things that they are supposed to be away from, to flee from. And they are. But because of that, they're experiencing suffering. And yet, so this is the fascinating part about it. And yet, in 1 Peter 2, Peter will say, respect those in authority. Honor the emperor, right? Fear God. And it's like, how can he say that in light of what they are experiencing? And I think it's because Peter ultimately knows that there will be justice. So I don't want to act as if the abuse will be dealt with. Hence, husbands, be aware. But I think the reason why he can still say, respect the authorities, and yet continue to follow Jesus, continue to do good works, even though it causes you harm, is because ultimately the source, the agents that are causing the suffering, are behind the veil, if you will. I know you guys just had Shane Wood on, so I'm using some language even from him, but it's behind just the physical. There's something spiritually going on here, and that's going to be this dark realm.
I'm wondering, I think there's something very beautiful and powerful in this idea that, like, yes, there is injustice and pain, so much suffering happening right now, but look at the bigger picture. At the end of all things, God will bring about justice. The oppressor will be made last, and the oppressed will be made first. But at the same time, that does feel like Karl Marx's critique was that the religious worldview pacifies the poor, the weak, the sufferer, by making them content with their lot here and now in this life, because, hey, it's okay that you're being oppressed here and now. You're going to get heaven in the future. So just endure. Just suck it up, buttercup, and keep suffering, and don't revolt. What might you say to that sort of critique that just says this gives some eschatological hope to the oppressed, but it doesn't help them actually break out of their chains now?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
has
Can
to
you
go
refute
through.
it? Can you refute a very complex philosophical political system in under 100 words?
No, but I can at least give a response.
Yeah.
um, no, I appreciate that comment too, Jonathan, and I wonder it too. That yeah, Christianity, religion is fed to the poor. It's fed to those who are oppressed and who are disenfranchised to keep them where they're at. Right. That's kind of Mark's argument there. I deal with this a little bit in my chapter, not full on, but I actually got a critique from the editor of this work that was super helpful. Nika Spalding, when I was reading this and just presenting my ideas on it to the rest of the contributors, she said this to me, and I just appreciate it. She said, "Matthew, I hear what you're saying, and I know your heart, so I know you're not saying what you're not saying." And so I was like, "Thank you," but I can see someone totally reading this and saying, "So if you are in an abusive relationship, then stay in the abusive relationship." Right? Wives, if you're being hurt by your husband, like clearly that's, I mean, I chose that passage on purpose, knowing how hard it would be, the First Peter 2 and 3. She just said, I could totally see someone saying, this validates staying in that oppressive place. And so I was like, okay, I need to address that because I don't agree with that. And so it doesn't full on deal with the whole philosophical thing, Jonathan, but I can say this. In Peter's world, and I think this is the same even for Paul, because I deal a lot with Paul and slavery. You'll see that a lot there, that he just doesn't ever come right out and say slavery just needs to be done. And this might be a cop out, but I don't think it is a cop out. I think it's just the case that Peter understands that the people he is talking to have very little privilege to actually escape from what they are dealing with. It is only people who have privilege who can say, I can end this and walk away from it. Okay? You can't tell a slave, hey, I know you're being told to do stuff that you shouldn't do. I know you're being hurt by your master because now you follow Jesus and no longer his master or her master. So go away. No, I'm sorry. If you go away, you're going to become a refuge, right? And they're going to come after you, and they're going to take you back, and they could kill you. They have every right to kill you in that time. Matter of fact, you probably just wouldn't even survive by yourself. Like, we just don't see that often, that slaves being able to escape and then be able to actually have a life that's actually flourishing or even surviving at all. Same thing for wives. There's no, they cannot just be like, okay, I'm done, I'm walking away from this during that time. And so I do want to say that Peter is addressing people in his context, which is very good for us to not therefore misapply these texts today to say, well, you see, Peter doesn't get rid of slavery. He just says slaves like continue to like do good things. I think if Peter understood, and I'm putting words into Peter's mouth, I think Paul would have done this at least because of his letter to Philemon. But I think if they understood that there is a place for, no, you actually could be set free from enslavement or captivity, and like there would be no harmful effect to you besides like actually just getting to that, I think they would have said do so. And so I say that for us today, Jonathan. Marx is right in the sense of that I think he's seeing how these texts have been used to just leave people in oppressed states. And I think we can say, no, the text is about freedom, but they're in their context. They have a certain amount of privilege, and we have more privilege if you are in the modern West. And so let's think Christianly about this without just saying it's a clear one-to-one situation. Anyway, that would be my response. I have another thought, but it's totally just escaped me.
That was a brilliant response. And it's, the Marxists are always the ones saying privilege. And you're like, I'm turning privilege back on you now. So that's good.
I want to return to something before we leave it too far behind, the spiritual warfare thing. He's including this in. And we brought this up in the context of it's not always a test from God. God's not always testing you. What Peter's doing is saying it's this spiritual warfare going on. But you also brought up Job. And what was occurring to me as I'm wrestling through this is, for Job, it seems to have been both. You have the Satan figure who's attacking Job. There's obviously the spiritual stuff going on that Job has no idea about. But we also get the 10,000-foot heavenly view that's just, it actually is a test from God.
Yeah, yeah. And I was literally thinking that earlier today too, Seth, of what in the world do we do with Job? I will say this. There's no denying that Satan is still present in that whole situation. So it's not just God being like, I'm going to test Job because I feel like testing him right now, right? We see God testing his people. And it doesn't seem like there's any suffering even about it, right? So I think Genesis 18, matter of fact, the conversation that God and the three strangers have with Abraham when he says, I'm going to go to Sodom and Gomorrah and destroy these people. I actually think that's an invitation for Abraham to enter into a test, and to see, do you really know me? That's usually what the tests are about that God gives. I'm not saying it every single time, but a lot of the times the test is, do you know what type of God I am? And Abraham seems to pass that test. Literally, I'm using literally like a millennial. You say literally and then you don't mean literally. But metaphorically,
we are millennials.
Yes, I am. Yes. Paraphrasing, God tells the angels, the other two strangers there, I'm going to see how much Abraham knows about my righteousness and justice. And then Abraham responds to this, I'm going to go destroy these two cities. And he literally mentions, but what if there's righteous people there? Would that be just? He uses like the same terms. And so I think he matches like the test. I think he actually passes it in that moment. And so the question would be, what's the test for Job? Is it truly, well, he only follows you because he has all these good things. And maybe God's like, okay, cool. Like, let's do that test. I think it's fascinating that Satan is literally there, the one that's prompting it all. And at the end of the story, you get to ask the question, does Job even pass the test? Does he do it? And I don't know about you guys, and this is honestly, I'm going to maybe punt the question back to you, Seth, with this. But Job at least passed the test that he does say, again, just thinking off the Devo that I heard just earlier, he gives and he takes away. But then he sits in the silence. His friends come, they sit with him, and they immediately start saying, you must have done something wrong, right? You must have done something wrong. And then he's like, well, hang on. No, I'm cool if maybe God took something away, in the sense of he's definitely not cool with it. But if this is God's will, then okay. But don't say I'm the blame for this. And so, of course, he gets into the very long discourses of back and forth between them. And I think the answer to Job, at least when it comes to the book, is that God still shows up and responds to Job's crying out, his confusion, his even protesting to God of what's taking place. And so I don't know if that even answers the question, Seth. I think Job does it does kind of bleed the categories together of, is this from God or the evil realm? But it seems to be that clearly the evil realm is part of this. And Job does pass some sort of a test, if it is actually a test, by saying, this is wrong. And God says, all right, I'm going to be with you in the midst of this wrongness, if it is wrong. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. And I was actually talking about this with your and my president, Matt Proctor, yesterday, about something about Job that the great theologian Sheila Hart, my mother, the nurse, told me once, is the great thing that what we don't realize about Job, she told me this when I was a kid, is part of the story is the fact that we're reading it.
Exactly.
Part of the answer to the question is the fact that we're reading it right now.
Yeah.
And you kind of forget that the answer to Job's question of why am I suffering is because the book was written down to give hope for people for thousands of years. This future-looking thing that you're part of the story. Like the reader is part of the story, and you forget that, And this, I remember as a kid, I'm like, oh wow, But that's never never left me, that this
Mm-hmm.
this forward-looking thing of seeing the whole story and seeing your place within it, that you're never going to understand the full story except from the end. Good
Yeah.
Friday wasn't called Good Friday on Friday. That would have been quite, insensitive, to put it nicely. It was called Good Friday from the perspective of Resurrection Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So God is in the midst of us, with us here, right? Which I love that. There are this other demonic, evil, behind the veil sort of stuff that Shane Wood talks about, but there's also this eschatological view,
Yeah.
right? And I think you touched on that in your article, right? I think you've even mentioned it so far, that we need to bring the eschaton into this.
Yes, exactly. I love that part, and that's how I approach the Book of Job. It's there to be read and wrestle with continuously. I don't know if there's a single answer you walk away from the Book of Job like this is the answer to all of the Odyssey questions. But so I just love that that comment from your mom, and I would say yes. What Peter seems to want to put in their minds again. So we're going just off of what they would have dealt with, and what I see a lot of people dealing with today is, I think he wants to say, use this suffering as a cue to think about Jesus. You use this as a cue to think about his suffering, his glory, and the future glory that is to come. Instead of, because what it is right now is whenever we suffer, we think this is a cue to think of, I've done something wrong, God hates me. And he's trying to say, no, because if that's the case, then Jesus did something wrong and God hates Jesus, which kind of creates an issue, right? So this is why in 1 Peter 2, he immediately goes into the suffering servant song of Isaiah 52 and 53 and just weds it with Jesus's trial and his crucifixion. I remember in reading it, it's very just fascinating because he doesn't quote it verbatim. He'll have a line from it, and then he'll introduce something from the Gospels accounts of Jesus's trial or his crucifixion, ultimately saying this is the same situation. And so he continues this all throughout the chapter 2 and then into chapter 3 of talking about how Jesus, yes, he did die, so he did go into the grave, but he was resurrected and ascended. And quickly he says, and then he declared to the spirits in captivity, right? Like his victory. And so I think what he wants to tell them is saying there is, after suffering, a glory that is to come. Is that suffering caused by God? No. But God is with you in the midst of that suffering, and there will be a glory to come. You have been liberated. And I think that sometimes is the key thing that we're missing from this. He deals with suffering, he deals with glory, but he also deals with liberation. The liberation of us, that we are set free from sin. We are set free from these powers that cause this destruction. And the way that we show that we've been set free from it is by responding differently to it. So he says, do not respond to slander as they're being slandered for being they're probably being called atheist, they believe in one God, or at least just not being good citizens any longer because they no longer go to the festivals, they no longer participate in the public showings that would have had idolatry. And he's ultimately saying, I know you're being slandered, but that slander comes from evil, and you are not to slander in return. This demonstrates the liberation that you have in Christ. He was abused, and yet he was glorified, and therefore, as you're abused, you know there's a glory coming, so you therefore don't return with abuse. So that eschatological matrix deals with suffering, and it says, it's not always you've done something wrong, karma mindset, which I think is really big for us. But 2, it gets us contemplating about, okay, what does the glory look like? What does Jesus's life look like? And I have one more thought on that, just real fast. But it's also, if I know that Jesus was raised from the dead, and yet he suffered, and yet he's still called close to God, that means that in the midst of my suffering, I'm also still close to God. That I'm still God's beloved in the same way that Jesus is God's beloved. And so we now in this moment enter a unique invitation to become more like Christ in the midst of that suffering. So I think that's Peter's big idea.
Yeah. Let me just summarize that quickly. It sounds like what you're saying is if you are presently suffering, look to the past and how Jesus suffered, and look to the future and contemplate where this suffering is leading.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's
great.
And let that therefore help you on how to respond to this present moment. So you have the past, you have the future, and then you have this, okay, so what do I do in the midst of this present suffering? He doesn't deny it. Yeah. Okay, I respond therefore how Jesus responded to it.
Yeah, I had a framework that I sometimes use. It's kind of similar, which is there are three things that we want to know in the midst of suffering. One is that God is inimical to suffering, that he hates it.
Right.
Number two, that even though an all-powerful, almighty God is inimical to it, that there's still some inevitability to it.
Yeah.
That it's not as if God hates evil, but let's just sprinkle a little bit of evil into your life anyway. There's an inevitability to it. Yeah. But to make sense of that, I think is real important. The third part of that is evil is instrumental. Mm-hmm. People need to know that suffering has a purpose, that that God hates it, he deeply hates it, but nevertheless that something good can come out of it. In fact, something maybe even better might come out of it. And if you can hold all three of those together, then suffering becomes more like childbirth, which is the analogy Paul uses. Yes. Something that can be incredibly painful and yet filled with purpose.
Yes. I love that. And within that framework, Seth, would you say, therefore, again, keeping all three in balance, God can use the suffering, yet he's not the agent of the suffering, right? So he's not the one causing it, but he can use it. Would
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's that inimical. He does it. He's not the agent. He hates the suffering, and yet it's instrumental. Yep.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because we don't want to slip into a worldview where light and dark are both in an eternal struggle, and where light needs the dark in order to be what it is, and where evil has to happen in order for good, and good has to happen in this sort of Star Wars, like the two sides of the force type of thing. Yeah, at the heart of the Christian world picture, good is the only thing that's absolute and real, and it doesn't need evil in order to bring itself about. It can use evil once other people have done it and bring about the best thing, but it's not necessary as an ingredient to the equation. And that's where the Christian view of will comes in, right? This didn't have to be this way. We could have willed otherwise. Humans could have chosen not to give in the garden. The angelic demonic forces could have chosen not to bring about evil, because this is an inevitable. Light does not need evil in order to bring itself about.
Yes.
In that sense, right?
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I love that. And I think, so I'm always trying to think through how to make this, face to face with people's just daily lives. And I was thinking about it earlier this week so suffering is going to happen even though it's not part of God's will. Even Peter says, to this is what you have been called. Man, I don't want to butcher it, but he talks about you've been called to something, and he mentioned that there's a blessing that's going to come with this, and yet it's in the midst of suffering. And so the question is, okay, are we called to suffer? Has God put that into our lives? And I don't think that's what Peter's saying. I think he's saying it is to be like Christ in the midst of the suffering that's going to come. It's not needed. You can be like Christ outside of suffering too. But the unique thing about Jesus is that he went towards the cross. He went into suffering. And so as we follow Jesus, and this is where I just think, again, the life of Peter is just so fascinating because he's so against the cross. He's so against a Messiah that has to die. And yet finds out along the way, this is the way, I guess, and he ends up following suit with it. And so again, trying to just bring it back down to just daily lives of people as they are experiencing suffering. The way I think Peter thinks about it, and I think the Christians think, I think Peter gets all of this. I end my chapter with, I think Peter tells the Christians in Asia Minor what he heard from his friend and his Messiah, Jesus, when he talks about, blessed are the poor, for you will inherit the kingdom. I think he is just trying to say, this is what it looks like to actually live this out daily. So the way that we live our lives is to say, there is suffering, but because of Jesus' suffering and his resurrection, we experience like victory because we're in Jesus. We're with Jesus. He's victorious. He was abused. We are abused. He was glorified. We will be glorified as well. However, though, you have on this side still Satan, demons, and his minions, still evil at work. And I want to say that I don't know what they think, but in my framework, it is to say,
let us tell
they
you.
know, yeah, exactly. Yes. They know they've lost. I think that the game's over, but they're still giving up a fight, right? And in the midst of our suffering coming from the evil realm, the way that we show that we truly have been victorious is responding to it, not like them, but responding to it like Christ. And so it's the example, therefore, that we're trying to learn more and more. It doesn't immediately make everything easier. And I think that's a big thing I want to bring us to. I was writing, if I could tell a story real fast, I was writing this article and received at Ozark, we have this thing called the Care Group, and it's an email that you can subscribe to. And if you have something going on, this is with the personnel here at the college and the seminary. If you have something going on in your life, you can submit it to the Care Group, and everyone that's subscribed to the Care Group will get notified, and they can be in prayer for you. And so I was writing this article, got an email from the Care Group of someone that works here, whose daughter just a few days ago was rushed to the hospital, and they weren't sure what was going on with her. This is a young adult woman, and mother, wife, and a couple days later, I'm writing this article, get the Care email, and she's passed away. She ended up dying of sepsis. And so I'm sitting here, writing this article on suffering and how we're supposed to respond to it. And just get this, talk about deep loss in that moment. And so I don't want to act as if this solves how that person should feel in that moment. I actually do think this is the reason why Peter's thoughts are so important, to say it does come from the realm of darkness, because that gives us reason to truly lament, to truly cry when suffering takes place, instead of, I think, another response to be like, well, get over it, repent, or whatever it might be. To say, no, like, this is wrong, the world's messed up with this, and this is an example. So truly, like, lament in this moment. And yeah, this person that works here has gone through a lot of hardship in the last few years. And once again, today at our Devo, we're singing "Blessed Be the Name of God," which within it says, "You give and you take away," reference to the book of Job. And I just looked over at her, just to see how she was responding to this song, and just looked over and saw she's singing "Blessed Be the Name of God." Right? I think that's what Peter's trying to invite these Christians into. Of the suffering is bad. It comes. I love your thought to that, Seth. That God hates it deeply, and yet He's with us in the midst of it, and therefore He can show us, still how to be like Christ in the midst of it, and become more like Christ in the midst of it. So I use that story to say it doesn't mean that we immediately feel fine. Everything's good. We're great. I call it the Joker effect. When you talk to people at church and you say how you're doing, and they have a smile. Yeah, they have a smile on their face, and you look in their eyes and you're like, man, you're not okay. Like, there's something deeply wrong. And I think Peter says, no, there is something deeply wrong. Let's name it for what it is, and allow it, though, to be a cue to now think about Jesus and what the Spirit is up to in the midst of this suffering.
So, one last question. one piece of advice. You've talked about, people right now suffering, but there's likely someone who's hearing me talk right now who's in the midst of this. If you had one piece of advice for them, what would it be?
Yeah. I'm going to give 1A and 1B real fast. But 1A is...
Said like a good pastor.
Yes. The first would be
They have
this.
to start with the first letter. They have to start with the same first letter.
Yes.
Sorry, you're about to say...
I'm not that good. I can't do that. I can't do that on the fly. First would just be lament. Like truly sit in the pain and acknowledge it. Peter says that, Peter spends time thinking about Jesus' trial and his crucifixion. I can't help but wonder if there wasn't teardrops on the papyrus as he's writing it or someone else is writing it, right? This is his friend. I can't imagine him being so hunky-dory about the pain and suffering that his friend Jesus went through. And so I would say it's okay to lament, and you should lament and go to God with whatever is very raw to you, whatever feeling that you have. If it is very much a Job, where the crap are you, God? I don't have an advocate for myself to even talk to you because you're so high and I'm too low, and no one will come in between us, right? And so the Bible says it's actually okay to go with those raw emotions to the Lord. He can take it, and he wants to be in that conversation with you. So lament, cry, let it out, and be okay with being in that for a season, whatever that season is. But the 1B would be asking this question. Clearly, God doesn't avoid pain. He doesn't avoid pain. The crucifixion demonstrates he doesn't avoid pain. So he's not avoiding you as you're in the midst of this pain. So where is he at in the midst of it? And what is he trying to make all things new, as we're going to use some New Testament phrasing? How is he trying to make all things new in this moment? I'm not trying to say the answer is the pain will go away, or the answer is everything will be solved even in this lifetime. There's even an aspect of that we just have to acknowledge. But I think we can trust that there is going to be a glory that follows suffering. And so this allow this to be a moment to say, how is God close to me in the midst of this suffering? That would be my advice.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the book again?
Yes, so it's called And Upon This Rock. And the big long subtitle is Peter's Transformative Journey from Fisherman to Follower to Foundational Leader. There you go, Jonathan. There's your alliteration for you. Fisherman, follower, foundational leader.
Love it.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Where can people find it?
You can find it on Amazon. Cascade Books, Within Stock, of course, is a publisher with this, but of course can get it on Amazon. And also, I just would love to put this out there. If you want to have more conversations on this subject, or I've actually done some teaching on the Book of Lamentations that's available online too, of just trying to sit in a book that we normally don't like to do sermon series through, unless it's just Lamentations 3, which is the really good part. But if you're interested in diving more into this idea of lament and sitting in the suffering, I would just recommend some videos that I've done with Ozark Christian College in the Next Level series.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. It was fun.
It was interesting that we were nuancing the difference between, God causing something versus God harnessing and redirecting something. Because I teach that God in the Holocaust class at my university, the University of Jamestown. Apply now. But at the beginning of the class, the first day, I ask all the students, does everything happen for a reason? And unanimously, all the religious students say yes. But by the end of the class, I do the same question, and they all say no. But they, at that point, do think God is present in our suffering. He doesn't cause it, though. And I think so many Christians have had this entrenched view that all things happen for a reason, that they have to assume that God is punishing them or that God is using this suffering as an ends to a means, or that this is a test. Like, they have to fall back into those frameworks, because they have this implicit, perhaps it's a Calvinistic influence, that all things happen for a reason. Not all things happen for a reason.
Yeah, they do.
They have no. God can
Yes, they do.
take what happens and use it for a reason, but that doesn't mean God forced us to choose evil and to bring about evil.
Those are
I
two
don't think
different
God-
things. Those are two different things. Saying something happens for a reason. If you're literally saying the solution to the problem of evil is to tell people their suffering is meaningless, you're going to have to say more to convince me.
I'm not saying it's that their suffering is meaningless. It's that God didn't cause your suffering for some higher reason. He can take what was caused for no reason and use it the best he can, but he didn't force us to choose evilly. Like, I don't think God caused the Holocaust. God can then take
phrase
the
it to you.
Holocaust and do the best he can with it. Go ahead.
Here, let me say this. Did God create the world knowing the Holocaust would happen?
I think
Yes or
God,
no?
yeah, okay. Yeah,
Yes.
but I don't think God caused the Holocaust.
He created the world knowing that it would happen. And he could
Okay.
have created a world where it didn't happen.
So you're
There you
saying,
go.
in a
Deal
broader
with that.
sense,
Deal with that, John.
the universe exists for a reason, but that doesn't
Yeah.
mean every single thing in it God directly caused for a reason. God allows us the freedom to self-create. I think this is, at this point, this is just semantics.
No, I don't think it is. I think the language here is incredibly important, and it's not just mere semantics. I don't want to belittle this, because, I mean, man can survive anyhow if they have a why. I'm fully on board with that. I'm not trying to belittle it. And I think that's what people get scared of, is you belittle the suffering whenever you give a reason for it. Because really then your suffering it's not really evil then. It's actually good because God used it for good. And I think what we're doing is we're functioning as what's called consequentialists. We're thinking that something is good if something good comes out of it. Does the ends justifies the means sorts of things. And we slip into that sort of thinking whenever we become cautious of giving any sort of justification for evil. And I do think everything happens for a reason. I think we need to hold tightly to the idea that everything does happen for a reason. It's not that nothing in what I just said God directly caused something to happen. So you're pushing these two together.
I think the possibility of the Holocaust happens for a reason, and that reason is free will. But the Holocaust itself was not caused for a reason. We could have done something differently. So this is where I say it's semantics.
Let me say this. Yes, we could have done something differently. Nevertheless, saying that does not negate the statement, everything happens for a reason. So
I
you
think we're
would agree with
combating
that.
different targets, because I'm not combating the nuanced view that you're saying.
Sure.
What I'm combating is the person who says God caused the Holocaust to bring about some sort of good on purpose. And there are Christians who do actually say that. And there are some Christians who think, there are even some Jews who believe that the Holocaust is the same as the exile in the Old Testament, where God is doing this for a reason to punish us. And I'm saying that when you say all things happen for a reason in that sense, I don't think that all things happen because God says, this is what needs to happen right now. I'm going to cause this genocide to bring about some later good. In
So
that sense, I don't think everything happens for a reason.
You don't
But I
think
do believe God
Almighty
is...
God. You do not. So you think God could have created the universe without the Holocaust,
Yeah.
and yet still chose to create the universe anyway, and just let it happen, even though the universe would have been better without it.
I think God had
That
to create
just
a
makes it
universe with the
worse.
possibility of Holocausts.
No, he
I
knew
don't
it would
think
happen.
for-
He knew it would happen. I'm not saying you're trying to add to what I'm saying. You think God?
Do you not
created the
believe in
universe.
free will?
I do.
Because
You're
do you think? Because I
you're
think we're
conflating the
this
two.
again. We're saying the same thing. This is
No,
where the
you're-
semantics comes out. We're
No, you're not.
saying
You can still say, hey, God knew the Holocaust was going to happen. God created the universe knowing the Holocaust was going to happen, knowing that he would bring a greater good out of it. Knowing humans were going to err, he wants a perfect universe. This is what I'm saying. We need to say God is inimical. He didn't want the Holocaust. He wants a perfect universe. Nevertheless, the evil is inevitable. Evil's going to evil. We do have free will, and we will choose evil. But despite all of that, God is going to use all of that to make an amazing story. that even the evil is creating a better result. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, a greater good than would have happened outside of that. So I think you're trying to combat two things that I'm bringing together, which is
No,
the
I think this
inevitability
is
of evil.
again
And
just semantics. I think
it's
if
not,
you want to
it's a
say
different
that
view.
everything happens for a reason, in one sense that God did create for a reason, and so all of the things that come with that, yes. And I think free will was allowed for a reason, and so God knew that people would use it badly in such ways as this. In that sense, yes, God willed the whole of existence,
Yeah.
even all, you know, like I
That's not
consent
just a
that.
possibility.
But the
He knew it would actually happen.
specific application of does God have everything happen for a reason, that God causes everything, which is, I think, something that a lot of Christians do believe precisely because they don't have these nuances. I don't think that is correct. I don't think God willed it. And so in that sense, I think we're using two different senses of meanings. And I think what you're saying makes sense, and I concede it as well. Like, I think we're using two different senses of everything happens for a reason.
I think if we're not careful, though, I guess maybe, but I think if we're not careful, we end up saying we don't really advance the problem. Like if we say God created the universe knowing the possibility of the Holocaust. No, he knew when he created the universe the actuality that this would happen. We just need to bite the bullet and say that. Otherwise, you're going to have to say God just didn't know the future. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
That makes sense? Yeah, so if you just say, no, he knew the possibility, and he could only know it as a possible in order to preserve free will, you're just an open theist. And I don't think you are open theists here. Does it make sense? That's my caution. I don't want to push us into this worldview. That the only way to solve this is to somehow lessen who God is. And that you see that in, like, you yourself know that. Like in your Holocaust class, you talk about perspectives that in order to solve the problem of the Holocaust, people limit God. They have to have a smaller God.
I think when most people say everything happens for a reason, they're not saying the very nuanced view that you're saying. I think they're saying something different than that, and that's what I'm trying to refute here.
Well, maybe because you accused me of Calvinism whenever I said
I didn't accuse you of Calvinism. I'm not targeting your view. I'm targeting a very popular view that uses the language I've just said, and then you keep retorting, but this, and I keep saying, but that's not what I'm targeting. What I'm targeting is how most people commonly use it.
Right.
Most people are not you. Most people do not have your philosophical nuance.
But here's the thing. What we need to do is not... You got people to a point where they're saying, no, everything doesn't happen for a reason. And I don't think that's the end of the story, is the problem. Yes,
yeah, I think
philosophical
most people
nuance.
in that class got to the point where they still believe in God and that God is active. Like,
yeah,
they just...
But then
they believe in free will.
They believe in free will, of course. And I think probably the majority of them did before that. But now, if you get to the end of that and you just think that suffering is completely pointless and meaningless,
I don't
have
think
you
that.
solved the problem? I don't think you did. But
I
at the end,
specifically said that God uses suffering, but I don't think God directly causes suffering and had a reason to do that specific act. I think there's a reason that the broader world where Holocausts happen is perhaps because God had to create us free, created for a reason, but I don't think the specific things were God reaching down and doing it. They might have been essential in the broader structure of free will, but that's not the same as God sticking his hand and interrupting nature to bring these things about.
yeah,
So.
and I get that. And honestly, I think probably the majority of your class, if you asked them, is God the cause of evil, they would also have said no from the very beginning as well. That makes sense? And so if that's what you're trying to refute, I mean, if you're talking about the way people commonly understand things, I don't think most people who aren't Calvinist think that God is actively, causing every single evil in their life. Now, some people do, and I'm not going to pretend they don't, but not all people, right? Because you said all your students say yes. I think some people do, but I think I know tons of people.
Most of my students believe that God sent suffering to teach us something. I think you're overestimating how nuanced everyone's views are, especially because we're in a post New Age culture where the idea of sort of a Western appropriation of yin and yang, where you can't have the good things without the bad things, where you have to be forced to suffer.
I think
those things are very... No, I think that's very popular in the common parlance. I think a lot of people don't really have any sense that good could exist without evil. If you push them, they might be like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of it this way, but they're employing lots of different ideas that are actually antithetical to their Christian worldview. They just haven't put all the pieces together and articulated it consistently yet.
Let me challenge you to rephrase this question to prove my point. Ask the students next time, do you think God is the one actively causing every bit of evil in your life? And I guarantee you the majority of them will say no.
I think that's a really helpful leading question that reveals something to them that they hadn't thought about previously. But it's not like you're revealing a consistency that they already had. I think you're exposing to them for that question their own inconsistency and helping them to come to a new realization on their own in a sort of Socratic way, because Socrates wasn't actually revealing what the guy already knew. He was actually giving him new information. And I think it's precisely that inconsistency in their own worldview that question would expose, and that my class exposed.
So in other words, they need the philosophical nuance that I'm trying to teach, John?
Not really. I think I already provided it with free will.
Nope.
But
nope.
As a free agent,
you didn't. I've pointed out a problem with that.
Let me ask. Let's pivot just to end on the final few minutes, because I had one other thing I wanted to do.
Go ahead, man.
I wanted to quickly outline what I think of as reasons for why suffering is caused, like different answers that are given, and then hear if you had any responses or views that aren't on there.
Sure.
So, like, where does suffering and evil come from? I think there's the human free will response, that human free will brought this about. There's sort of angelic demonic free will, that sort of a higher celestial spiritual free will brought about cosmic suffering. There's the punishment view, that we suffer because God is punishing us for past evil, which of course overlaps with the human free will view, but is distinct from it because it's not just, oh, human free will brought about global warming, which causes us to suffer. No, it's God is punishing Israel for their disobedience by exiling them to Babylon. So God is punishing us. That's why we suffer. There's the idea that suffering is an earthly test in order to bring about some sort of heavenly reward. Like you have to go through this, but then at the end you get, rewarded. Mm-hmm. There's the suffering in order to grow view, that like you suffer in order to become a better person. Suffering creates character and perseverance. There's the idea that we suffer to glorify God through overcoming. So it's just to bring about God's glory, because he's glorified for you overcoming the suffering. There's the idea that suffering somehow brings about is a means to some sort of greater end. Yeah, this sucked, but it needed to happen in order to lead to this, or to teach you this sort of thing. And then I think there's like the mystery view, which is sort of to some extent Job's view, that like you don't understand, but you don't have to understand. You're immortal and God is immortal, eternal, infinite. And then I think there's another last view, which is suffering is a result of ignorance. So that's sort of the Platonic remembrance view, that we need to remember, and that our lack of remembering is what brings about pain and suffering. And if you had greater knowledge or education, we could overcome human suffering and pain. That we need, suffering isn't the result of a failure of human will, it's a result of human ignorance. Yeah. And knowledge would overcome it, and learning, and these types of views.
I mean, there's
am I missing anything in there, or is those kind of the big picture attempts to explain how we got here?
I mean, I could give a minority report on other views. There's one view that suffering actually comes from a lack of virtue in your life, that the good man never truly suffers, because if something good happens to him, that's great. But if something bad happens to them, he can grow in virtue and learn from that. So nothing truly bad ever happens to him. And that kind of has traces back to some Stoic philosophy. And there's a few other views, like suffering doesn't exist, which...
Yeah, it's an illusion.
It's an illusion, right? Which kind of goes to forgetting. Those are
kind of related. Ignorance.
The ignorance, right?
If you truly knew what was going on, you would realize that you're not suffering.
Right. Suffering comes from the inability to realize that it doesn't really exist. If that's mind melding, that's the whole point, right?
And if you truly knew what was going on, you'd have no attachments, and so you'd never suffer when you lost them.
Right. Yeah. Suffering comes from attachment. I think it might be a good way to look at that. That's part of the Buddhist teachings, right? So yeah, I mean that's a good overview. We can nuance that out the wazoo, but that was pretty cumulative.
Well, and I think the Bible at different points enlists kind of all of those in different times and places. Like, yeah, I don't think all suffering is punishment from God, but like the exile in the Old Testament clearly was.
Sure.
But at the same time, like when the guy, who suffered that this man was born blind, and Jesus says, no one sinned that this man was born blind. It was just to glorify God that he had this. And so I think the fact that all of these are present in the Bible in different places is a testament to the fact that Scripture doesn't want to give you just one definitive answer on every issue, that sometimes it's inviting you instead into a conversation. I think that's a much more stereotypically Jewish way of thinking of Scripture, where what Scripture gives you is different voices from different time periods and contexts, and you need to listen to all those voices and hear what they have to say. And it's in the tension between those voices that you kind of experience God, right? If that sort of makes sense. Because I don't think any one of those answers to the problem of suffering solves it. But I think all of them working together in harmony do begin to help you move on.
Yeah, and I think that's why I said there's three things you want to hold about suffering. Those three categories I didn't invent. They came from a guy named Michael Lloyd who tries to say only one of those is correct. Those are three. He broadly categorizes the answers to the problem of evil into these three categories. I said we need all. All three are scriptural. All three are in the Bible. So, I mean, if you look at the book of Job we talked about, Job combines two categories. Was that caused from free will to glorify God, from evil, or to test? Like there's so many ways that you can approach why did Job suffer, and they're all in the book of Job. And some probably you can even talk about more so. Like I brought up the eschatological point of view, that seen from the end, we see how the good that it helped to bring about great things overall in this future-oriented view. So yeah, all that's a very long-winded way of agreeing with you, I suppose.
Well, and I'm done suffering through this conversation, Seth. Goodbye.